Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the chair of the MA in Curatorial Practice. Welcome. This is exciting for us because it's important for young curators to understand the full field of all the kinds of things in the world to curate. I was saying to Murray earlier, except curating your socks, curating your wine collection, the way that the word is being used currently today, but tonight this is a great opportunity to work with Molly. Our director of research, Ivana Stokic, had worked with Molly to do this tonight, and so I want to welcome Molly, who is the chair of Design, Research, Writing, and Criticism, and the panelists, and thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Sorry about that. As Stephen said, tonight's panel came about in large part thanks to Ivana Stokic, Director of Research here in the Curatorial Practice Program. And Ivana was interested, as our event says, in thinking about curating beyond fine arts. And over the course of some informal conversations that we had, we thought it would be worthwhile to probe the limitations, boundaries, and possible new freedoms of the politics of display as it relates to design. So because of its potential for mass production, design and the act of displaying design comes with its own set of issues and responsibilities. Tonight's discussion will consider the ripple effects that curating design extends into the wider world. And this panel aims to surface an array of questions embedded in curating contemporary design, from topics to objects, from sponsors to venue, that relate to social, political, and economic issues. So there are many directions a conversation about the challenges of curating design might take, but tonight we're going to mainly focus on the physical world, on three-dimensional objects, and try to take a close look at the relationship between design, object, and curator. What values are implied by curatorial choices, what due diligence is required, what value is assigned through selection, display, and promotion of objects. So we wanted to bring together a group of thinkers who are coming at the topic of curating design from different perspectives and see what happened and hopefully generate a lively debate. So I'll introduce our panelists briefly. So at the end of the couch, representing curator entrepreneur, we have Murray Moss, and Murray is the co-founder and principal of Moss Bureau, a design consultancy providing services to museums, corporations, and private collectors. He is founder of the internationally renowned design gallery Moss. During its 18 years in Soho, Moss was called the best design store in the world, and Murray was described as America's most closely watched purveyor of industrial design, and he still is closely watched. Murray is a lecturer, author, and curator, and conceived over 100 exhibitions for a wide range of venues, including the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Museum for Angewandte Kunst, or the MAC in Frankfurt, and the Warhol Foundation in Pittsburgh. Next to him, representing a designer-curator, is David Weeks. And David is a designer and the founder of David Weeks Studio, based here in New York. David studied painting and sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design, and worked in the Manhattan studio of designer Ted Muehling before he founded his own studio in 1996. And in 2013, David opened his own flagship storefront in Tribeca. One part gallery, one part creative lab. The store showcases the full breadth of the studio's collaborations and capabilities. They range from high concept light installations and furniture to products designed for companies such as Flavor Paper, Christopher Farr, and E15. And then next to David on the couch, representing museum curator and writer, Brooke Hodge is deputy director of the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum here in New York. Before coming to New York, she served as director of exhibitions and publications at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and before that, curator of architecture and design at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. And she has also been director of exhibitions and publications at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Brooke is a widely published writer on architecture and design, and from 2008 to 2014, she contributed to the biweekly column Seeing Things in the New York Times Tea Magazine blog. Her most recent exhibition, Provocations, the architecture and design of Heatherwick Studio, just closed at the Cooper-Hewitt, so I hope you all had a chance to see it. And finally, to my left, designer and educator Allan Chochinov. Allan is the founding chair of the multidisciplinary MFA in Products of Design, a graduate program here at the School of Visual Arts, just a few floors below. And he is a partner of Core 77, the design network serving a global community of designers and design enthusiasts. Allan's own work in product design included collaborations with Herman Miller, Johnson & Johnson, Federal Express, Kodak, AC Nielsen, Oral-B, Crunch Fitness, among others. And since 1995, he's been teaching at the graduate and undergraduate level, as well as lecturing widely, serving as a juror for design competitions and participating in a myriad of symposia, including the Aspen Design Conference and the Rockefeller Center at Bellagio, Italy. And we've asked each panelist to give some brief introductory remarks that will shed some further light on their perspective and also raise issues that they feel are critical with regard to curating design. So some people have slides and some people do not, but all will be speaking for under 10 minutes each, right? They've promised. And then we'll have a group conversation followed by questions from the audience and finally drinks. So, as I said, our touchstone throughout this conversation is going to be design objects. And I just brought a couple of slides to launch in. For example, this collection by designers Purcell and Steck called the Taboo Stool. So formerly a beautiful object, but if you were to encounter it in a museum setting, does your understanding of it change if you were to know that it is made out of 75% recycled plastic, that is manufactured by a small factory in Senegal, that factory is female-owned, that the designer Bibi Seck himself is from Senegal, and the shape is inspired by West African mealtime traditions? What if you could sit on it rather than just view it as one did when it was part of the 2010 Global Africa Project exhibition at the Museum of Arts and Design? And design has always been interactive. It's the nature of design. The Cooper-Hewitt Design Museum features an object of the day on their website. So what are the questions we want to be asking of this object? Moves the conversation about design and curating design forward. Who is behind those questions and who is the intended audience? At the Design Research Department, where I work, we define design quite broadly. Should we give the word curator and the act of curating the same latitude? I just popped up this article by Mia Tokumitsu from the New Republic from August. The title is The Politics of the Curation Craze, and talking about the loose use of the word curator today. And I'd like to come back to this a little bit later, but I know Murray may be holding forth on that very subject. So Murray, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll have David, Brooke, and Allan.
Hi, I'm going to try to do this. Molly, can you hear me okay? Thank you. Molly had suggested to us, I guess, that we sort of think about a topic to speak about within an 8 to 10 minute window. And I wrote down some bullet points, some things that were possible candidates, but then I never got around to actually doing it. So what I thought I would talk about were the bullet points, which are just some possible issues. And excuse me reading, but that's what it is. I don't have any images or anything. And just throw me out at 8 minutes. But I thought I wrote down originally some points to discuss perhaps on the subject of curating. The first bullet that I had was curated is the new black. And why is curated in something to be curated so in demand today? And I think it's because it's hoped that it will reintroduce good arguments and credentials, both which are terribly out of favor at the moment, not to mention out of fashion, and the best foundation for presenting ideas, including ideas presented pictorially. It certainly suggests a growing dissatisfaction with the ubiquitous, which we all know, commentator on social media, who rants and raves without ever being required to present an intelligent, well-articulated, and substantiated argument. Curated, I'm proposing, is the new black because it involves making an argument, as a lawyer does in a courtroom. And I believe that making a good argument, and to put it in populist terms, is the next big thing. I thought we could talk about possibly curated is now a corporate strategy for creating brand identity. You're talking about socks, was dead on the money. I have not curated socks, but I'm totally available through my bureau, and I hear that could be quite lucrative. What you put on the screen was interesting because this goes back to 2009 in the New York Times. The tipping point, which when I read that I thought, oh yeah, the tipping point, is a store in Houston that calls itself a sneaker lifestyle shop and doesn't just sell a collection of different colored rubber soles along with books, music, apparel. Its website declares the store curates its merchandise. This is 2009. Promoters at Pianos, a nightclub on the Lower East Side, curate a night of curious burlesque. Eric Demby, blah, 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 personally curates food stands. And to think not so long ago, this in the New York Times says, curators used to work in museums. The word curate, lofty and once rarely spoken outside exhibition corridors of British parishes, has become a fashionable code word among the aesthetically minded, I don't know what that means, who seem to paste it onto any activity that involves culling and selecting. There's another one in the Chicago Tribune, more recently, 2013. You have a Netflix queue, which you maintain, nurture, cull, and arrange. You curate movies. You have an iTunes playlist on your computer, and you probably tell a kind of story. You curate music. It goes on and on. And of course, the marketing departments, I have a bureau and I'm working on a commercial with commercial entities, obsessed with brand identity, which I wouldn't disparage any longer because it's what I do, have opened up, the good news is, the job landscape, which I think is something we could talk about, for professional curatorial skills, as they are redefined. And one website I visited features the title, How to Curate Good Content That Makes Your Brand Look Good in Social Media. Art is the new populist pastime. I go to art exhibits like all of us and art fairs, and a couple years ago, what startled me was I was at, I think, the Armory show, and it was packed. You know, the artwork can be very expensive, so I doubted all these people were buyers, but it was packed. And we waited in line, got our tickets, and we're looking at the art. And I overheard this couple, a man and a woman who I presumed were a couple, I presume were married, based on their conversation. And the man said to the woman, they were having an argument about this one work of art they were looking at. He felt it should be in the collection and she didn't. And he said, I really, really strongly feel this should be in our collection, if we had a collection. Will people begin to hire curators to curate imaginary collections? Will people hire curators to curate virtual exhibitions? Because you don't have to have a collection. You don't have to have the thing, if you think about it. What you have to have is just the entity could be a list. It could be a something completely virtual, and that could be open up a curating door. Arguably, this is a new idea, new thought. The best curated collection I've seen is the Barnes. What I thought was amazing about the Barnes collection is, as you know, they have this painting called The Postman by Van Gogh, one of the great paintings ever, I think. And the guy did something really weird. He put it, the postman is the jewel in the crown. I mean, that's it. So if you got the postman, you put it over the proverbial mantle. That's how you don't mess around with it. He put it all the way to the left, so to speak, in the corner, next to, God forbid, I could barely say it, a Renoir. So when I saw this, I thought, oh, Mr. Barnes was raised by wolves. Because I thought, it's how brilliant. How do you, I would so book learn that I would be incapable of doing that. How do you start from the beginning and make your own decisions? And my question was, if I can find it, do we educate prematurely? In other words, do we brainwash as curators? We are told what is good before given the opportunity to determine it on our own. Do we present objectivity where we should allow for subjectivity? I wrote this thing, which I might just skip, but I write this column for this magazine, and this is coming up in a couple months. But I just wanted to, it occurred to me that what I wrote was, I assign instant blockbuster status to any museum exhibition whose title begins with either treasures from or the golden age of, even before the exhibition opens, disregarding the possibility of a more considered personal evaluation. And I'll just read one thing. I wrote, and any exhibition having a title which begin masterpieces from, I reflexively presume will be nothing less than super awesome. In this month's column, well, this is for this magazine, I summon my grit and ask, on what basis do we distinguish a particular work of art or architecture or design as a masterpiece? One obvious answer is that we are often simply told in the title of the show that these are masterpieces. This draws crowds because many people would rather anyway skip the process of having to make that decision themselves, preferring to attend an exhibition showing work which the host museum has predetermined meets today's professional standards of masterpiece. With internet access to nearly every major museum collection in the world, we need a shortcut in order to get through it all, and what we are eliminating, or it seems that people are choosing to eliminate, is our own individual response to the work. We don't want to pick the finalists. We want to see the winners. Curatorial skills today are applied to a much broader field of endeavors than just museums. I'm curating, not the socks, but something that could be considered on a par with it, which I'm quite proud of, condominium amenities. We have been hired by developers of big-time buildings, glass towers, to curate, i.e. put together a package of 3 amenities which will give a brand identity to this building and get people to buy these $40 million apartments. This they're referring to as curating. And what I wanted to share with you was one of the amenity packages that somebody else had done was the amenity package that was curated. A chauffeur's lounge, discreet exits which avoid paparazzi, and you also get a wine-tasting pagoda on a high floor. I'll just leave that at that. Museums on occasion seem conflicted between supporting an age-old agenda or exploring new ideas, new values, new perceptions in regards to that collection. And I'll just tell you, then I'll be done. I had a brief experience with the V&A a few years ago, which was very privileged, of course, to be able to, I was asked by the London Design Festival to curate an exhibition of this Belgian company's work, which was producing 3D printed, very extraordinary objects. It was still early in the game. And they gave me the opportunity to, because I've been going there for 50 years, to choose my favorite objects in the collection, in the whole of the V&A, and to juxtapose maybe 24 or 25 of them, I can't remember, with works that were 3D printed to make a story out of it. So the first thing that I did was go to this empty niche. It wasn't a thing in the museum, but when you come in the exhibition road, I've noticed over the years that it's empty. It's been empty for 50 years at least. And so I thought, how cool would it be as a curator to put something in the niche to draw attention to the fact, because there's a Roman god at the top of the steps looking down at this empty niche. There must have been a Roman goddess or something there looking up at this guy. So this person, believe it or not, called the keeper of the niche, And the keeper of the niche said, "You ain't putting anything in my niche." And I took this very seriously, and I said, "So your curatorial ambition is to keep the niche empty?" "Yes." So I said, "So in other words, you curate nothingness?" "Yes," so to speak. So I went to other people in the museum. I just went above her because I figured, at that point she hated me anyway. And I won. Because I said it will accentuate the void if you fill it for 7 days. Sounds curatorial. And in that same instance, there's a very famous Medici Renaissance column, and I wanted to put something on the column, and then I had to go speak to the keeper of the column. That's what it's called. And the keeper of the column says, "You ain't putting anything on my column because it's not a column. It's art." Hi. "It's art." And I said, "Yeah, but why can't it for 7 days have a duality, be art and a pedestal again?" I was going to offer to re-pedestalize, which I actually said to the guy, this pedestal, and he said, "No way is that going to happen." And I went above him, and I lost. They said, "It is art, and you don't put art on art." And I just wanted to say, ironically, I was hired by these very fancy people who have a huge collection in New York to go to their house in New York and advise them, because they had decided to decorate their living room in Brancusi. And they have a Brancusi fire mantle, what do you call it, fireplace mantle, and they wanted to know, the question to me was, as a curator, was it too much to put a Brancusi on the Brancusi? And I just want to say, to end, curating is appropriately affected by the same winds of change as is making art. We define and we redefine it as we need to, yet something never changes. This author, Jack Cady, wrote, "We are not humane because of political powers or education or even religion. We are humane because we recognize the humanity of others." This empathy with humanity of others is what I might consider indispensable as a curator. Thanks.
So my name is David Weeks. I'm a designer here in New York. I studied painting and sculpture, and I kind of stumbled into design once I got to New York. The process that I've taken on, my whole career has been sort of a search, and as one thing gets not tedious, but I'm just always looking for the next step. And you probably know my work from a lot of the shelter magazines. It's been very successful over the last 20 years. There's couches, there's other ones, tables. And all that, again, it was in 1996 when I started doing that work. I developed it for about 5 years, and I started showing at Ralph Pucci International, which allowed me to start creating vignettes and sets for the pieces. So it wasn't just individual pieces anymore. It became more a whole expression and more full settings. Having the Pucci showroom as a canvas was a great opportunity to make different environments and show the work in different ways. It led on to a lot of different things like carpets and all the furniture. And so again, I started unearthing new disciplines. And in the process, as you're making things, you have ideas to make other things. At which point, I made the wooden animals, which sell through Areaware and have done very well. But then I always make the joke that this was a cry for help, in the sense that that was what I was known as, which is great, very satisfying. But it's nice to have that in your resume. But this is what felt more like where I came from. and what I grew up with and what I was really enjoying doing at the time. Look at that. Raw, man. No, so the animals led to the Cubot, which is pretty ubiquitous. You've probably seen it. And that opened up a whole other world for kids' toys. This is a video. Is there a way to press the... That was like, I always loved that thing because it's that little campfire was the first sort of piece, even before the animals, that we did for Kickerland. And it allowed, kind of opened up the field and sort of changed the whole process. And it felt a lot more the art, more like the sculpture and the art that I was making before that. Lindsay Allan and I started Butter back in 2000. And that was another effort to kind of change the sort of perception of the studio. This is a vending machine. They were all boutique items, all very nice. And we had to search for a vending machine that would take credit cards at that time. So everyone was buying like Sears and Morrison flip-flops and, you know, albums from different people and feature model cozies. It was a great opportunity. It was really fun to sort of, again, try to tip the whole system on its head. The Cubot grew into sort of different environmental things. Okay. And it got to the point where finally I felt like I'd amassed enough work that I needed a new venue to show it, which is when the retail aspect of the exhibitions come in. I opened a store on Walker Street about 2 or 3 years ago. Look how empty it is. But it's, and it was such an strange experiment. But again, we'll talk about that, I'm sure. Just as far as like, as a individual trying to sort of present a whole body of work. And Murray, Moss is phenomenal, I can only imagine. Yeah, I've yet to even scratch the surface of what Moss has accomplished. But we had done different exhibits, and it's always been sort of an experiment every time as to how we've done it, how we collaborate with other people, and what other objects we show. It's always fun to have a party. We did large installations in the space. And here's, anyway, this is a chromium chainsaw carved gorilla head. Just throw it out. Anyway, that's it. So.
Great. Now, thank you.
Can you hear me if I just speak into this microphone? I'm Brooke Hodge, and I'm Deputy Director at Cooper-Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum, but for close to 25 years, I've been working as a curator mainly of architecture exhibitions, which present their own particular challenges because unlike design objects or fine art, we can never show the real thing because obviously you can't put the thing in the museum. So we always have to work with representations or sort of mediations of the actual building. And it's something that I'm interested in as a challenge that I think I haven't fully satisfied as to what really makes a successful architecture exhibition, because often they focus on the process because one shows drawings or sketches or study models, or in, say, early days at MoMA, the architecture exhibitions were almost like books or magazines on the wall with images on the wall and then very refined presentation models. So in a number of shows that I've done, I've tried to capture certain qualities of architecture, whether it's scale or materials, or it could be process shown in different ways. But I still think there's more work to do on that subject, and probably one of the most interesting architecture shows I saw was many years ago, the Frank Gehry show that Mildred Friedman curated for the Walker Art Center, because it actually included a full-scale piece of Gary's that you could inhabit, and you got a sense of the scale, and the actual materials were used, and you could see in some ways how, how it felt to be in that space. So I'm going to show you just some images of a few of the exhibitions that I've curated more recently, or I guess not totally recently, but for a number of years I directed the Exhibitions and Publications program at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and our gallery was the lobby of the school, so it was a very challenging space, but this was one of the most interesting exhibitions we did. It was an exhibition of the work of Comme des Garçons, that Japanese fashion designer. And we worked very closely with Rei Kawakubo, and working with living designers is, to me, really interesting because they're there and you can have a dialogue with them and they can inform how their work may be presented. And so it can often lead to a really interesting exchange depending on the designer. And in this case, we worked very closely with Rei, and we created these structures that were like pavilions. If you remember the Comme des Garçons store in Chelsea when it first opened, and it had these kind of Richard Serra-like enclosures, so these were very similar to that. I think you can see a little bit here. They really changed the nature of the space in the Graduate School of Design because it's very linear, and when you enter, there's a security desk that's fixed to the floor, and it's a sort of a cube-like structure, ironically called the donut. And so this totally hit it, and people would come in the front doors of the gallery and they would be, not really sure where they were or how to get to where they wanted to go. So that was really interesting. And we showed no actual clothes, even though we were showing the work of a fashion designer. So we covered these enclosures with large photo blow-ups of some of the collections, and also images that were inspirational to the designer. And then we included several flat screen TVs that we placed on the floor inside the enclosures. Then I moved to Los Angeles, and I worked at the Museum of Contemporary Art for a number of years, and this was a big exhibition that I curated on intersections between fashion and architecture. And this had its own challenges too that I didn't really think about right away. The nature of scale between what I could show of the architecture, which was representations of it, models, drawings, etc., and the fashion, which was actually life-size. So in galleries where there were mannequins with the fashion pieces next to architecture, it often looked like the architecture was sort of like a dollhouse next to a real person. So it was an interesting conundrum, and I think in some parts of the exhibition I could handle it more successfully than others, and then in some places the fashion really tended to dominate, and then we had to push the architecture, especially two-dimensional images, to the wall. But it was a really interesting show. The first gallery featured this collection by Victor and Rolf, the Dutch designers, and it occupied the space when visitors first entered. And then I worked with Calvin Sau and his team at Sau and McCown on the exhibition design, and they really changed the nature of the gallery space at MoCA. It occupied the whole main floor of the Grand Avenue building, and they opened up vistas from the south galleries to the north galleries that had previously been sort of chopped up and closed off. And the transitions between the spaces were handled really gracefully. So that was something else that we could do as part of the exhibition, was to really change the way people experience the space of the museum. Here you can see a few more of the fashion pieces. We tried to include some larger scale sort of architectural pieces, like the structure that you can see in the background by Tess Giberson, who's a fashion designer, but whose work at that time was very closely tied to architecture. And we had Greg Lynn create this bubble wall that he was experimenting with. He was working with Panelists, and so they created this full-scale wall. So that also helped to sort of create that experience of what something like that would be in reality. And then most recently, I organized an exhibition, and this is interesting, going back to what Marie was saying, this whole trend now to call anything that's edited or culled or selected curated, and that everyone wants to be a curator, but actually in most museums, even if our title is, say, Curator of Architecture and Design, the credit line or anything else always says the exhibition was organized by so-and-so. We never really say the exhibition was curated by so-and-so. So it's kind of interesting that we use that in our title, and we might say, I curate exhibitions, but we often say the exhibition is organized by somebody, which essentially is what it is organizing a group of material and editing it to create something that speaks to a particular thesis or theme. So this was the exhibition devoted to Thomas Heatherwick and his studio. I organized it for the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas.
It was beautifully organized.
Thank you. And it traveled to the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles and then came to Cooper-Hewitt, where it just closed at the beginning of January. And in the exhibition, I wanted to do several things. I wanted to show the range of Heatherwick's work. I wanted to create a sense of what it was like, or what it is like in his studio. And I needed to introduce him to the North American audience, because it became clear to me that even though he was quite well known in the UK and overseas, especially in Asia, he really wasn't that well known here in the US. And whenever I would say that I was working on an exhibition of Thomas Heatherwick's work, people would say, "Who is that?" So I'd have to name a couple of projects, and at that point it was only a couple of projects: the UK Pavilion in Shanghai for the Expo in 2010, and the cauldron for the Olympic Cathedral. And then most people, architects or designers, would say, "Oh, okay, I know who that is," but most other people still wouldn't know. So I wanted to introduce the studio by showing a range of projects, from some early work to more recent work, and I also wanted to show the scale of the work that the studio does, which could range from a Christmas card, excuse me, to a multi-story building. And we displayed everything with questions that the studio asked itself as it's beginning the problem-solving process of tackling a design challenge. And those questions were really useful, I think, to our audience, especially at Cooper-Hewitt, where we try to follow an inquiry-based method with our educators and our docents. So the question immediately engaged visitors with, thinking about, how did they solve that problem, or how would I solve that problem, or what steps did they go through, and they wanted to learn more. And so it was a way to get them into reading a bit about the project and looking at what was on display without sort of dulling it down immediately by just having what we fondly call the tombstone information up front. So this was a project in Manchester, and we showed this little sculptural object that Thomas had created just out of pens to show how he's interested in a similar form but at different scales. And then this room showed some of the earlier projects, including the Christmas card series that the studio made for about 15 years. And we tried to show as many pieces as we could without plexiglass vitrines, so that there was a more immediacy for the visitors and the objects. And here's the spun chair, sort of showing the process from the prototype to the actual fabricated mass-produced chair, and also the more unique sort of artist version or artist edition of the chair in the background, that up higher on the pedestal. And we included some pieces that could be operated, like this model of the large span rolling bridge. And so every day we would have somebody demonstrate it and talk about the model and that project. And so that gave another level of information to the visitors. And we also included this full-scale mock-up of the back of one of the new London buses that the studio's designed. So it was important to me to show different scales in what I chose for the exhibition, rather than and it made it more lively, I think, as an ensemble of pieces. But I would say probably something that I dream about doing is doing an architecture exhibition that has no models or objects or anything in it, so there would be no shipping, which is always the most expensive part of organizing any exhibition, and just do it through film and create, I always think of Doug Aitken's project that he did for the Venice Biennale many years ago, where he created this amazing sort of filmic sequence that you could walk through. And so to be able to do that for an architecture exhibition, I think could be really would capture the essence of the work in a much more direct way than many of the traditional ways that we commonly use in museums. Thank you.
Welcome everybody. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the invite. So my talk tonight is called "Do Objects Still Matter?" which is the title of the evening. And I guess my answer is yes and no. And I can't stand actually talking about the difference between art and design. I'm going to look at my slides, which is the thing I tell my students never to do. So of course that's where I'm going to begin, because I think it's actually important tonight. So this is the only time I've ever done it, and I will pledge to never do it again. So I want to start with a quote that really stopped me in my tracks. It was probably about 8 or 9 years ago. I was at Pratt. I was on a committee to discuss like a core curriculum for all art and design students. And one of the department heads, Sheila Peep, had said, well, and she's a fine art department head, and said, well, you know, we're preparing our students for a clientless world. And I had never heard that term before, and it kind of just, I was just like, wait, stop. And then, of course, reflexively, you know, we think about, well, what do we do ourselves? And I think that in design, we're probably preparing our design students for a client-full world, which I think is kind of horrible. And it's legitimized with this phrase that designers are in the service of industry, which I think, and I'm fairly vocal about this, is a very dangerous thing for designers to be in. In terms of modes of engagement, I think that artists don't play by the rules. It's why I love artists and actually like artists when they come over to the design world. And I think that designers play by very rational rules, and again, often rational worlds that are dictated by market conditions. Classic design education fundamentals, to me, are things to master, and sort of from a very cliche point of view, point, line, plane, volume, texture, color. People think of these actually as the design paint or the fundamentals. Always form, always function, and always beauty. And I have a few thoughts on beauty, but actually the next triennial's theme is on beauty, so I should probably watch my mouth a little bit. The contemporary design education fundamentals that I want to happen are things to be as opposed to things to master. I want designers to be authors and entrepreneurs and critics and cynics and alchemists, and I couldn't figure out if it was speculators, which sounded sort of financial, and speculists, which sounds like speculum, and I was a little worried about that. So I don't know what that word is, but it's something certainly provocateurs, and then this leads us to the word curator, for sure. And now to curatorial objectives. It seems to me, and I don't study curatorial, but it seems to me you're working with theme and inspiration, with point of view and criticality, education and scholarship, and provocation and engagement. There's also archivists and several other fundamentals, I think, to curation. It also seems to me that the levers or the negotiations in curation are form and structure, form and content, form and context, and form and agency. And probably we could agree reasonably on these things. And what's interesting to me is that they all have the term form in there, that it's always the thing, the stuff, the object, which I guess is part of the agenda tonight. And it's this stuff that's actually more interesting to me, that I think the designers should actually be engaged in. So I started this program, it's in its 4th year, MFA in Products of Design, and really the foundational inquiries for that product are what are the contemporary products of design? Is a business model a product of design? Is a hack? Is an entry on Instructables keyed into the online maker community? As opposed to beautiful things, and what are the contemporary materials of design, which I'm going to say a little bit more on in a second. And now I will only show you pictures, because that's more text than anybody can bear. So the first design material I want to show you is about amplification. So for the past 3 New York Design Weeks in May, the students have gone into wanted design and actually performed design. The consequence of a class is called design performance, which argues that design objects can't sit on the pedestal anymore if they ever could. They actually need to be engaged with. In many cases, they literally have to be performed. So this was the sort of wellspring. This is what wanted design looks like. It's in an old nightclub you may remember called The Tunnel. It's very, very long. It's quite large. It's filled typically with thousands of people. This was our booth where everything was missing, because what the students did is they did these mobile cart interventions that were all about the display. And so in some sense, hacking the wanted design exhibition of products. The first one is called Boom, where students would walk around with a fake boom mic and aim it at chairs and tables as if they could talk and have an opinion and a point of view and something to say. And from the backpack, people would listen. So the students wrote script and hired actors who would say things like, I see you and you're staring at me and you're all excited about my light and my lumens and like that's good, except next year, you're gonna want the new lamp. Like, I'm not gonna be here next year, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. So it was really interesting to try and, in some sense, personify what these objects could be if they could talk. This one was called Tiny. It was about designers being obsessed with the details and never seeing them, particularly in a trade show environment, which is very sort of party-like. Designers sweat the tiniest of things, the seams, the materiality, and often it's overlooked. So this was a digital microscope that was mobile. Students would walk around. There were 2 or 3 of these that would go around and highlight these details. The designers really cared about this. The people in the booths, the actual designers or exhibitors, loved this because it was a very strong show of respect, and so that was nice. And then, of course, very quickly, this happened. Do my clothes, and then this happened. So we had to sort of bring it back to the furniture and lamps. So yeah, predictably. This was my favorite. This was called Lift, commenting on the idea that people at an exhibition always have a mediated experience, right? The phones are in the hands, everything is going on Instagram, you're always, Facebooking and tweeting sort of where to meet up and all that stuff, and you're not there, and of course this is worse and worse or better and better depending on your point of view. So we thought that your phone could actually have an experience that you couldn't have. So Wanted is this very tall space, and so we would load, this is sort of out of order, we would take your phone and we'd ask you to put it on video record. We put it in this sort of dock and raise it up to the ceiling, you can see up here on the left, way up, and then spin it around while it's recording video of this sort of overview of this massive exhibition space. And so you'd be just waiting there, and it was your phone who was having the design experience, right? So you were out of it. And then after, the students would open it and hand you back your phone, and then you could walk away, watching the experience, the video that your phone had. And so this was sort of great, because you were kind of on your phone anyway. Here's the students. The next year was really about rephysicalization as a design material. The students were really interested in digital behaviors, as I've just commented, and so this was called Mission Control. This was tricky. This is Adil, who is the founder of Wanted Design, co-founder, and so we were a little bit worried about sort of hacking her exhibition. She actually loved this, and we've been back 3 years, and we'll be back for a 4th. So here the students had these mobile signs that people or organizers, visitors or vendors would essentially take over and say, listen, I need something to happen, can you go publicize this? And the students would walk up and down the exhibition space with these things, with some usual suspects. And they had there was a whiteboard version, there were these refrigerator letters, and then there was this very low-tech letterpress, which was really, really fun. So people had to do it slowly, and because they had to do it slowly, they had to engage with the students on like, sort of, what the fuck's going on here? Why are we doing this? And then the students could talk to them about digital behaviors in an analog space with people and not technology, and really reducing things to low tech. The visitors quite loved it, I have to say. This was the catchphrase of the whole thing, it's not real until it's been blogged. Pixar didn't happen for many of you. And then this was my favorite of all, of course. I'd like to think that they got engaged at Wanted Design, but I think that they actually got engaged the night before, but shared it with the world here. And then finally, this last year, audience and attendees as the design materials, taken to the next level, and really performance as a design material. And the students wanted to do a project around gender. And so this was the most dangerous and the most fun, scary for the students. And so they, once again, this mobile display where they would walk around with these fixtures. This is entering the New York City subway and essentially crashing parties in Soho on Saturday night. Murray, I'm sorry that you weren't there. You would have, or you weren't open. You would have loved this. And so we went to different showrooms where people would try on body parts. I've said before, like this was not, I didn't particularly like this one, but people loved this one, of course. This one I did love. So these line elements, you could, in some sense, try on different body parts. Immediately, of course, the first thing that happened was like, oh, take my phone and get a picture of me. So at this point, I'm not even sure that we were questioning digital mediation. We were just accepting it. I don't think we were playing to it, but it was very obvious how people were interpreting these things. And not interpreting them as particularly cheap, actually. These I was very worried about, but people quite loved it. And there was very little sort of giggling and making fun of. This was my favorite. This is students walking around with these plastic babies dressed in gender-neutral clothing of green and yellow, and you had to sniff the baby and guess the gender. And the trick was that underneath the caps were these commercial deodorant sticks, like sort of, Old Spice for men and Secret for women. And people never got it right? The scents were completely arbitrary. So that was nice, sort of a game. And then this was definitely stole the show. This is Young, who would ask to take your portrait, or draw your portrait, and he'd show it to you, and people would freak out because he would flip the gender. He was such a good caricature artist that he could draw a likeness of you, and if you were a man, turn you into a woman, and a woman and a man. It was just the two genders at the time. And people really loved this and wanted to keep them. There's another usual suspect. And then finally, the last project I want to show you is permission as a design material. So this happened last November. It was in sort of an off-election year in this country. A lot of people don't vote, and certainly a lot of people didn't vote. But people are typically ashamed of not voting. And so the students set this up on Election Day in Washington Square Park, which is a pretty politicized place, and created a non-voting booth that people actually stood in line for. And I kind of didn't know what it was, but I don't know. They weren't voting. I may as well do this. And so what would happen is the students did a bunch of research on why people don't vote, and some of these are obvious, and they didn't trust the system, they voted last time, it didn't work, they didn't know it was an election that day, and then there was a write-in one called Because. They made stickers, and when you walked up to the booth, you were greeted by these students, and you started to engage in a conversation of why you didn't vote. Essentially, you would pick the sticker that represented your rationale for not voting that day. And then there was a conversation about that, and then you would, this is a write-in, and then you would take the sticker and you would actually place it on the non-voting booth. So this is a kind of graffiti, vandalism, civil disobedience with a very sort of sweet touch. I don't want to overplay this. And then the students made buttons, I don't vote buttons, that people would actually pose with, and it was very much like, oh, get my phone, like I gave blood today. So this is something you would never be proud of, right? But this design intervention gave the visitors a kind of permission to talk about, or to at least acknowledge that they didn't vote, and to talk about why. And I think that this is kind of remarkable, and I actually want this to be the job of designers moving forward. Thanks. Yep.
Thank you, everybody.
So, as you see, a variety of perspectives we have here this evening. But David, you're a designer. Do you buy into Allan's materials of design?
Yeah, Allan.
Did you buy it?
No, I love that. It's sort of examination. And that's one thing I use.
One of these mics maybe to that table.
Yeah.
We'll be able to pick it up.
Yeah, I like the examination of almost any field, and I think there's a nice emperor's clothes kind of aspect to design that your sort of analysis kind of brings to the fore. But it's funny because in the same way that you sort of unearth these sort of reactionary moments for the students, I also felt sort of saddened that, sort of as you ripped the veil off the product. I mean, I don't know, I'm sort of confused about retail and how design is and what it is. Because there's all the high-end aspect of design, and there's sort of the big money stuff that everyone buys into.
I guess I would push back. Like, one of the things that we were very careful of was disrespecting the work, the exhibitor's ordeal. And so a lot of these interventions were actually trying to amplify what designers cared about. If lamps could speak and tables could speak, obviously pokes fun. And because the work was graduate work, it needed to have some heat and some riskiness to it. It couldn't just be fawning and we're working for wanted design. And there was a lot of discussion about where that line was. The ultimate test would be like, I can't believe I let this happen in my space, or please come back next year.
No, it was a great.
But it was, you know, the discussions were really the sort of the criticality of like, what are you doing? You need to be playing with fire, but you can't set things on fire. Particularly around the gender stuff is fascinating.
Yeah. No, I think it was great. Again, I just loved the tearing the surface off of what you expect or what you don't expect.
So I'll pick up Murray, who believes that curators should be making an argument. And yeah, I think a lot of this, in what Allan's talking about, speaks to that idea. And you know, when we spoke a little bit before the panel, and you had also talked about the idea of the curator not being an anonymous entity, you know, the curator being someone who was out there in the sense of someone whose background you should be aware of, whose biases you should be aware of. Can you talk a little bit about that idea of the curator being transparent in terms of their own agenda?
It goes back to subjectivity and the humanity. That there's a person who comes from a certain place, has a certain gender, is a certain age, has a certain set of experiences, and through their unique filter, their human filter of their experiences, they have an argument. And it's not an argument which you pick from a tree, it's an argument that comes, that even identifies itself because of who they are. What did they read? Where did they go to school? What grudges do they have? Who do they hate? Who do they love? All that. How much money do they have? How much money do they need? What are they? I mean, all that stuff. And I believe deeply that that is what one brings to, if you're doing your job, you bring as much of that. You don't negate that and say there's a neutral me, a neutered me, which is what's valuable. You say the whole kit and caboodle is what I'm bringing to this. What do you think? And with the objective that you invite, if somebody believes that, sees that, smells that, which is what I think you're doing, then what the real kick is, it invites the audience to do the same. So you're looking at an object, and you're actually creating a discussion about it. You're breathing. You're making it alive. And it's believable at that point that it could talk to you. So that's why I feel strongly. And it's curious that as a community and as a job, the curatorial sort of identity is stifled. It's interesting what you would say, even the use of it, because I think that I don't know why that is. Unless it's, I think that in the shops of museums, there should be a special, for every exhibition, there should be a special installation of I am the curator, here's my favorite, here's what I read in the last 5 years, here's a picture of my best friend, here's the music I like, whatever you think is or is not relevant, because that's what it's about.
Yeah, like Paola Antonelli actually loves molecular biology.
Right.
Like it's not a surprise that she's
And
using
also, it means that that you could do the same exhibition with 10 different people in a row, and it wouldn't be the same exhibition, because the subject isn't the subject, isn't the subject. The subject is the reflection on that subject of the what do you call it? Not the curator, the organizer, of the organizer.
Sorry, she's lukewarm on molecular biology, a synthetic biology that she's in love with. It's for the videotape.
Indeed. Yeah. She also learned how to code herself.
For that live blogging.
There you go, exactly.
Brooke, what's your take on this curator?
It's interesting because I think Murray's right that in a way, even though museums are full of curators, that isn't really foregrounded. It's the exhibition is there and it's presented by the museum. And it's really only been recently, and still at some museums, including Cooper-Hewitt, the curator's name is not, like if you went to the Heatherwick show at Cooper-Hewitt, you would have no idea that I curated it, because my name wasn't anywhere attached to it, because we didn't prepare a special brochure for it. It was the brochure that was prepared for every venue. But at the other locations, because they actually acknowledge their curators on their introductory text. It would say, this exhibition was organized by Brooke, Hodge, whatever my title was at that time. And so that's been a trend that's starting to open up more in museums, that actually the curator's name does get attached to the show on the title wall of the exhibition. But some museums still don't believe in doing that for whatever reasons, I'm not sure. Maybe it's to maintain this sort of so-called neutrality, but in effect,
neutrality.
right, a curator is already taking a position by choosing what they want to include in an exhibition or whose work they want to exhibit. They're already basically putting their own stamp on that person's work and saying, I find this interesting.
Can we go to the topic that Allan can't stand, which is the difference between art and design? And actually, Brooke, I was going to ask you, since you've worked in art museums as a design curator, can you just talk a little bit about the differences and the endeavors of curating art and design, or if you think there are any?
I don't really, I organized some art exhibitions also at MoCA because we would, other people didn't really organize architecture exhibitions, but because it wasn't a very big curatorial staff, I, would coordinate the Louise Bourgeois show when it came to LA, or I would organize an exhibition of a young painter. And to me, the process was still very similar, of meeting with the artist, if that was possible, looking at their work, choosing their work, thinking about how to present it in the space, how to sequence it, etc., how to communicate it, what I thought was important about it. And it's the same process that I would follow for an architecture or design exhibition, but with different material to work with. And in an architecture exhibition in particular, one has to show more things related to an architecture project or a building to kind of explain it, I think, unless you just do a show of models or photographs, which is less interesting to me. But what is interesting is that seeing certain designers that I've worked with over time really want to be considered artists, and not just designers, because they're still struggling with the fact that maybe being a designer is seen as more commercial and it's less kind of, can't think of the right word, but fine art. Less, yeah, maybe, but one example is Roy McMakin, who was always kind of ambivalently not, wanting his work to be seen as art, but also was designing, had a whole factory that produced pieces that he designed for sale.
How did that affect how you presented his work?
I didn't do an exhibition with him, but we did do an exhibition with him at MoCA, and we just showed pieces of his work, which often he would produce things in limited editions, so maybe it could be seen more as, editioned art or edition design. But it was, the way it was presented was more installation-like, so it wasn't just a sort of, here's this dresser from this time period, and here is this series of chairs. So it was how it was presented that was interesting. But it was interesting to me that, why some designers want to kind of run away from being called designers or being shown as designers. They might want to be shown more in an art museum than a design museum.
David, do you want to address that one?
Yeah, I think that's always a good place to play as far as being a designer, to find that little middle ground. I'm not sure, I feel like the definitions are sort of disappearing at this point. There's truly the artist, and there's definitely the designer, the Rubbermaid versus the painter. But I think I like the fusion of the two, and I think the sort of opportunities that gives to give art rational rules and to give design some freedom. It's a nice spot in the middle if you can find the right note to play. And it's also interesting to see how the market and the audience, has also made it much more willing to sort of read and take chances on design. than it's been in the past. But
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna ask Murray to speak to that with, with Moss, your store. You were very much taking art world strategies to present designers. So, can you talk about that and your kind of understanding of artist versus designer?
Well, there was a time when I was really interested in that subject, and I've lost any passion for it. But because I think you can sort of call yourself what you want,
Yeah.
and call yourself what you need to call yourself. I say I'm tall. I'm 5'9". I think I'm tall. But I literally, not to be flippant, but I think it's the same.
Yeah.
If the word artist gets you up in the morning and gets you to the table, then be a damn artist. Then be an artist. And who am I to say, but that's not my definition? Who cares? It's what you're doing. It's the work product, let's say. And if you want to see yourself shown, positioned in this way or that way, that's a part of your art. Like Tupperware. Tupperware wants to be sold in a home. That's a part of the design. It doesn't want to be art. You know, I did a Tupperware party in '95 with Tupperware, which with a legal document that could fill this room, and they thought that and I showed it as art. I had them make Tupperware in black, and I made these very artistic looking presentation, and then the Tupperware ladies, which is what they're like to be called, came in and were invited to do their thing, which looked like yeah, and that's when I realized it doesn't actually, not that it doesn't matter, it matters what you call yourself to you. It doesn't matter, it doesn't make any difference to me.
Well, Tupperware is a great example of a mass-produced product. So now my question is there, with presenting design, a responsibility to address the issues that may go along with that fact that mass production also involves not just artist/designer, but a whole industry, manufacturer, materials that have to be acquired in large quantities, perhaps. So.
Yeah, and a lot of that's absolutely evil. Hidden labor practices, hidden extraction costs. It's just, you scratch the surface of any of that and you actually want no part of it.
Right.
And then this is, part of the agenda tonight was to talk about design for social innovation and how you actually present that kind of work.
Right.
And one of the challenges with that is it's not terribly visual. It actually is pretty visual, but I think people have a prejudice that it's not. There's a kind of nerve and a kind of realism and honesty that's required to present those stories in any way that's accurate without just being completely insanely cynical. I think you can pretty much be pretty cynical about this stuff. It's pretty bad out there, which is, I think, one of the reasons why designers start to wonder about their impact on the world and how they could flex their creative muscles in other ways. It is the responsibility of institutions, I would say absolutely the museum, to talk about these things. And lots of them have a really great record. Cooper-Hewitt, absolutely. Most famously designed for the other 90%. And what was the second one? Started with a C.
The first one was designed with the other 90%,
Right.
and then the second was
Yeah.
designed for the other 9%.
Yeah.
Or no, the first one. Anyway.
Yeah,
one
there
or
was
the
a
other,
correction
and
on the second
was
one,
cities.
critical, yeah, on urban design. And those shows did very well, actually, and the press loved them, thankfully. So I think that
We're
there's a
doing another
place,
one.
yeah, that's right. Again, I think that this obsession and fetishization of objects and beauty has to be balanced with what actually is going on in the real world and what do people, in some sense, need to care about. I think that there is a leadership role for museums and for curators. I think one of the reasons why, and I think it's just completely fucked up that your name's not on the wall, just to say that. But I think that this idea of curation being so ubiquitous is a consequence of abundance, of the internet, of Pinterest. I love Pinterest. I do it before I go to bed. Someone said, oh, do it before you go to bed. And I just like collect stuff, and I'm interested in all sorts of things. I know, like, you know, one of my students, Panisa, is this like expert pinner, and I like to follow her. And then when you pin something, things like it show up. Does anyone use Pinterest? Will you after tonight? It's just this incredibly satisfying thing. And you had said like virtual collections. I'm collecting things. I do not need to own these things like at all. I don't actually need to be followed. Like I have lots of followers. I mean lots. On Pinterest, and I was just like, ooh, should I be private? And then I'm like, nah, I don't know. I'm not going to think about it anymore. I'm just using Pinterest. So there's so many ways you can curate collections of code on GitHub. I think that some of this is a consequence of platforms and of this sense of abundance in the world that we never had before. Just distribution pipes that are like massively wide, with, in some sense, everything being digitized, flowing through them. And so lots of people can tap into these flows. Well, what are they going to do when they tap into them? Well, they're going to take them, and they're going to take lots of them. If they take lots of them, they have to organize them. And so they organize them, and that is a kind of curation, because taste is involved, and point of view is involved, and the criticality is involved, participation's involved, and people are involved, right? People made these things, whether you're collecting sort of makeup tricks, or crochet patterns, or, you know, beautiful lamps. So I see this as a really great thing, actually. An amazing thing on planet Earth that should be used for the powers of good and not evil, and in many ways it is.
I think we might be interested to talk about what the expectations are, what the common expectation is of one's responsibility, one's obligation, one's God-driven duty, that you're supposed to, what the rules are, if there are rules, if you acknowledge yourself as a curator. Because I have a big issue with that.
The professional, the sort of like.
Well, I think that it's that I believe in like the free market. I think I take an expansive position on pretty much anything that I can, other than outright absolute evil. And I think that, you know, I was hit when I had a store with 1 million different angry voices of what my obligations were, as I'm sure, and I can only imagine what the curatorial, you know, the museum world is. And of course, you're always turning your back on some agenda. You know, I didn't do anything about to further acknowledge about aeronautics. Okay, I never was gender balanced. I was way, but then again, I was in the UN. And so sometimes something interested me, sometimes I left, and sometimes it didn't, and I figured if the person who is interested in that, go open your own gallery.
Would you say someone who works for a more public institution, like a museum or?
Well, Cooper-Hewitt is literally a federal institution.
But it's not, well,
Right?
well, that goes
Different
about public
roles.
space and
Yeah.
private space.
Yeah.
You know, people go into a museum and they go, this is a public space. It ain't a public space. It's a private space that's made available to the public under your rules and regulations,
Except the Cooper-Hewitt.
except the Cooper-Hewitt. But that's
I think it's an interesting example.
yeah, that would. But for the most part, I think that you call yourself what you want. I could call myself anything I want, and have a discussion with you, and I'll present my argument for it, or I won't. I'll just say I don't want to talk to you. This is it. Go away. But I.
Come in, don't come in.
But I do think that there's, to define, you know, we were talking about, like, so what are the responsibilities of a curator today? What are you supposed to do this, you're supposed to do that? I'd be curious to talk about that with you. I mean, not to
Yes,
steal
no, I mean, that's a
the
good
topic,
question, yeah.
but I think, do you feel that I mean, you're in a really highfalutin position here. And whether your name's on the wall or not, you have a very public
Yeah, it's a big
persona.
platform,
You
which is-
have a big platform, and my God, it's like the Smithsonian. Do you feel that you're in a box? Like, is there behavior which is expected of you?
Not really, and I would say at Cooper-Hewitt, I'm not a curator there. I'm more of a museum administrator.
Yeah.
So the exhibition of mine that was shown there, I had organized for another museum. And it's interesting thinking about the audience, because when I worked at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, our audience was mostly the students and the faculty. And we would love it if the general public ever showed up and came to see an exhibition. But it was, they changed quite quickly, but we could also be maybe sort of more free about how we showed work or how much interpretation there was of it. There was an exhibition of Sana, the Japanese architecture firm, where it was all white and the plinths were white and the models were white and there was barely any text. But we could kind of get away with it because we were in an architecture school. If we did that in a museum, it would be harder to get away with unless it was considered a kind of artistic installation, I guess, rather than an exhibition of this firm's work. So in a museum, the way it works usually is that curators sort of pitch ideas, and then a group of people, their peers, and the director would sort of say yay or nay to things, and then it would kind of proceed into development. And it depends on the museum.
Is there a political correctness? I don't know what other term to.
I would say probably at Cooper-Hewitt there is somewhat.
Is there boundaries?
But less so than the Smithsonian museums that are in Washington. I think because we're in New York, we have that distance, we can get away with a bit more and do things, and also we're the design museums, we can do things that are more out there somewhat than other places. But at MoCA, when I worked at MoCA in Los Angeles, once an idea was green-lighted, then nobody else really sort of messed around with it. Mm-hmm. Like nobody would say, oh, you can't put that artist in or that designer in, or you need to present it this way, or even the exhibition design often didn't need to be approved. It could just sort of be developed and unfold. So it was kind of interesting to see how things work at different places and what kind of structures are in place to kind of vet ideas and sort of shepherd them or not.
I think it's an interesting question of the marketplace and what institutions have a responsibility to do what, or if they take a responsibility. I mean, I'm with you. It's like call yourself what you want, do what you want. I think that there needs to be a balance in terms of the not journalism that is fed to everybody right now, and the lack of a business model for journalism, which is heartbreaking. That there need to be journalists, and there needs to be hard work, and some sort of training and pride in craft for doing things well.
But why would somebody be encouraged to be a journalist today when, look at what happens if you get 25 million hits as a blogger? You trump any thought that the school journalists could have. They're not going to be heard. Or I don't mean that to be.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that this is a raging. I don't even know if it's a debate anymore. It's sort of a heartbreaking fact. However, there are now a lot of curating platforms. Podcasts are very sort of popular again. And those are so driven by point of view and actually some scholarship and hard work, particularly the massively successful ones. I just, I recognize the fact that I wouldn't give up. I still get the New York Times in paper every day. It's just, and I know that there's very few of us left. But, and I find the online experience of reading New York Times or NYT Now actually quite unsatisfying. So this is the paper of record, who is in some sense first to digital. Still, it's not as interesting to read on a phone is BuzzFeed or Bored Panda, for instance. So I think I think content has a medium that it likes, and certainly people are being given an onslaught of options in terms of Flipboard or other kinds of RSS readers. So again, we're back to a form and context debate, which I think is fundamental to any kind of creative endeavor, and certainly in curation, right? What is the thing that wants to be shared, right? Is it a story? Is it journalism? Is it a beautiful couch? How does it want to be shared, right? Like, what is the vehicle? What is the platform? And sort of most importantly now, I'm afraid, where is it being shared? Because it's being shared on the street, on your phone. And so, like I save things to Pocket when they're longer than a paragraph long. And I have all my long reads in Pocket. And you know how many of my Pocket reads I've actually read. So I'm curating my long read feed for when I'm on a bigger screen, right, at home on an iPad. So that the context, the content, the form, it's always this negotiation between these things. Is there like an ethical imperative? Is there a moral imperative to actually what's on there and which on there is what? I would love to think so. I think it's probably naive to think so. I think like venture capital is running everything, and venture capital cares about time and money and nothing else. And there is no moral compass to business and never has been. So I think this is why creative people need to be a sort of a balancing force of goodness. And people who want to have a point of view, you could call it taste, you could call it scholarship. There's a place for like deep knowledge, for deep practice, and to try and speak loudly enough where people are noticing that as well as pictures of, it's like National Squirrel Appreciation Day today. Just thought I'd throw that out there. Did you know that? I didn't know that. One of my staff knew it, which is amazing and horrifying.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there certain, what do you think? I'm sorry to just,
No.
are there certain things that the term curator, which I take ownership of as I define it, and you take ownership of as you define it, and I'm willing to define how I take ownership of it, what the parameters are, but there seem to be correct applications for what that activity might suggest and incorrect. And what do you feel about a curator moving between the so-called commercial, in other words, you're curating something which is ultimately going to be sold, and the museum? Because in the museum, something also happens where it's sold to the museum in more cases than not. So you never escape the commercial. But do you teach in the school, is the curatorial practice here inclusive of curatorial work that's both they began, the socks, curating socks, as well as curating paintings, or?
It's a question for curatorial practice people. We can.
I mean, do you have to choose, is my question. Is there a right and a
You
wrong?
flip the tables and ask the audience
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. Should we ask Stephen, you want to address?
Because I'm curious about what people are being taught as you know.
Well, the way that we think about curating is quite specific. You talk about activities, but we think about process. We think about methods. We think about disciplines. We think about histories, and we think about philosophies. Because there's now a deep literature in the 20th century, and certainly since the 1960s, with Harold Zeman, who changed the field of curating from that idea of the keeper who maintains a collection to someone who is a creative personality involved with other creative personalities. And so when we think about curating here, we think about it as another form of making, just as painting, sculpture, design, photography, film are taught here, and all of those practices. So we don't say we're photographers in a very general way here. We think about the challenge now that photography has been dramatically changed by the fact that I have this in my pocket. So all of these ideas about how we think of curating within a political, economic structure What are the ethics of curating? How do we think of it in a neoliberalist society? These are the sorts of discussions, debates that happen all over the world now, as I was saying to Murray earlier, as more and more of these sorts of programs are started. So this is a very deep technical conversation. It's a craft conversation as well. What we do is we train curators in the different ways that curators work. How do we think about display? I think that Murray, in the days of Moss, did a better job of curating and displaying design than MoMA did, more creatively, more thoughtfully. And those are the sorts of issues that we think about. You know, these are issues where in this program, and a lot of these programs, you study lighting design, installation design, how do you use SketchUp, how do you use models, what's the difference between thinking as a curator of film programming, curating objects, curating surfaces, curating using screens. All of these things are very specific technical practices as well. So it's, you know, I think that this conversation in a way is indicative of the dilution of curating to say, oh, well, I can curate this, I can curate that, and I think about, you know, the students of mine in the room and elsewhere that, no, this is a very specific thing. And in fact, it could be, and there are elsewhere in the world now doctoral programs in curating in the sense that it just takes more years to think through all these different aspects of this thing called curating, which now doesn't mean anything. It's okay. You can call it organization, keeping, design, curating, whatever, but there are specific things that you learn to do that.
I think that that it doesn't mean anything. I think it does mean something. It's simply there's a second shoot of drop, which is, oh, you're a curator. What are you? Then the next question would be, it's like, I'm a sportsman. What's the next question? What's your sport? So, which is the good news for the subject, because it's not presumed that it's just one thing. You must work in a museum. Which museum do you work in anymore?
Well, and there was a recent piece in the Times about how there's been this sudden sea change at the Museum of Modern Art, where finally there is interdisciplinary, across-department curating. And so that notion of interdisciplinarity is one that feeds into very large ideas about the way human society is being transformed electronically, digitally, socially, geographically, temporally. So interdisciplinarity is just one way of opening that lid onto different ideas about knowledge production and knowledge distribution.
I also think it's another mirror to abundance, where people are thinking about more and how do we actually look at more, because more is just pouring at us all the time. And I see it as an opportunity, you know, something very positive. And economically, you know, we live in a world of abundance with an economic model that is based on scarcity. You know, if I have more, you have less. If you do the math, everyone can have lots. But politics and economics dictate that it's a sort of a zero-sum game. That is the real next shoe to drop, which is it possible for, you know, the planet to reimagine its commercial, you know, mechanisms so that everyone has certainly enough, but probably plenty. This is the grand project for humans, in my opinion, in the next 20 years. Someone actually has to point to it and you know, lead the way.
I have a beef with museums, which is something's in a museum, and what people say is, I bought this because it's in a museum, which is not a good thing. Okay, you bought it because it's in the museum. Why is it in the museum? I bought this because you skipped the museum part, because that shouldn't be relevant. I bought this because turns out this Dieter Rams calculator is actually a landscape. It's a garden. He figured out intuitively how we manipulate this instrument comfortably. I mean, that stuff, that's why it's in the museum. The fact that it's a museum is immaterial, or it should be, and yet it's never kicked in.
Well considered, I guess, is the common denominator.
Yes. Right.
It's just unbelievably well considered by people who make their
Right.
livelihood considering things
Right.
with depth and seriousness and a little bit of sense of humor.
Well, we can wrap up, I think, but just to circle back to, Allan, you were talking about Pinterest and, Murray, with the way you're describing your approach to curating. I think, there's also this idea of a sense of pleasure and enjoyment in it. And I think with regard to some social design issues that came up, that is one thing to be considered. I was reading back through some notes from a event Allan participated in at Bellagio in Italy, a conversation about museums and social design, and Jamer Hunt, who runs the transdisciplinary design program at Parsons, said with regard to exhibitions that focused on design and social change, sometimes it felt like eating a bran muffin. And I think that there is a kind of danger in you can't be too didactic, and it can come across as heavy-handed. And so, at the expense of that idea of what you were saying, Maria, of personal discovery of enjoyment of a object.
Well, what I think the good news is for the curatorial field is that, first of all, more jobs it's becoming a field you can get a job in if you open it up, okay? Which means there's going to be more discussion about it, you're going to get better teachers, better voices, stronger voices, because it becomes viable. I like that. But I also like that it's becoming akin to saying, I'm a dancer. I'm a curator, I'm a dancer. You kind of get it, but you need to know more. And I think that's as opposed to what felt like a week ago, which was a curator got it. That's what I think the good news is.
So let's take some questions from the audience. I hope you have some for our panelists. And while we're waiting for some questions to come up,
Does anybody know any curators? Like I can remember, like Emilio Ambas was one of my heroes because of this exhibition in 1972. Is that a common thing? Like he's like an action hero to me. Does anybody in this, because you're all here probably involved with the school or in the profession or something, are there heroic?
Curatorial icons.
Curatorial icons. Who's yours? Do you have one?
Yeah. That's a good question. It's a hard one.
Yeah.
I would almost say it's somebody more, I don't know if they're not, like somebody like Joe Ponte, who kind of curated whole environments but wasn't officially designated a curator, but was looking at all different kinds of mediums and disciplines and telling a story.
okay, so
Yeah.
okay, here a question.
Did Thomas Campbell curate that exhibition on Tapestry, or did I screw it
Okay,
all
go ahead.
Yeah, when think about curators, designers, and autonomy, I think about once in a while it's like designers who are designing for a specific curator. One comes to mind is like Anna Wintour of Vogue. I was speaking with a few designers, and they're saying like how they want to do their own thing, they want to be independent designers, but at the same time they've used the word I gave in and I wanted to join CFDA because what Anna likes, everyone else will like and buy. Like do you think that this like translates into the design world as well, with kind of designers giving in to what people like giving into what curators want?
I'll show you, jump in there.
Sure, please.
In a way, I think it's, in a magazine, it's kind of different than in a museum because the magazine has an editor and the magazine itself has a point of view, and in a museum there probably is a sort of range of curators that would all have different points of view. And I've never come across anybody, and I would say that most of the exhibitions I've done don't look the same or don't have the same themes to them. So I've never had anybody say to me, oh, my work is perfect for the kinds of shows you do. So I think it probably would happen less in museums unless somebody is the curator of a very sort of specific area, like say they're a curator of glass or something and somebody's a glass artist. But even so, there would still be a range within that that curator would be looking at and presenting. So I think it's less likely to happen. And what does happen, of course, is people coming up and, sending emails and saying, oh, I'd love to have you visit my studio. It would be great if you could come and look at my work, hoping that it could be considered for an exhibition at some point. So that's sort of how it would happen, I think, more in the museum world than in the kind of magazine world, where you're really getting this gigantic seal of approval, and Anna Wintour's, seal of approval vastly outpaces the Cooper-Hewitt seal of approval in certain spheres. So I think it's interesting, but I think it's a kind of a different world.
I also think this is where the internet cuts both ways. The promise is that there's lots of voices, that some of, for instance, the fashion bloggers on YouTube have as much say, if not more, than she does. The media doesn't write about that say, and the commercial world may not serve that say officially, but they're paying very much attention to it, sort of, in the real meetings going on. So that's a great side of the internet. More editors, more style makers, more people who have a story to tell. The downside, of course, is that the winner wins on the internet. We're seeing that all over the place. There tends to be one winner. Google, Uber, sort of name it at this point. And so that's really, I think, to the dismay of a lot of people, that the web that, you can read lots of articles written about this, the web that we built is dead, is dying. Because the market controls the web, because internet companies are controlled by capital. And capital wants to monopolize. It always did. So we're seeing this incredible tool that, in some sense, had the potential to democratize everything, and yet is very good at consolidating money and power. That's a sad story. The great story is that there's still tens of thousands of people who are kind of brilliant in their opinions and have a microphone just as loud as anyone else's. And that's an amazing thing. That's the thing that we want to fight for, that we want to keep populating through programs like this, because there's never been a better time, for instance, to be a design journalist. Yeah. It's harder to pay the grocery bills with that journalism. But I think being a journalist was always a trick. It was always a juggling act. So maybe it's not so different now. But in terms of finding readers who are either like-minded or want to be challenged with your opinions, these are wonderful days.
I had, there's this person who I think would be considered a world-class serious journalist in the field, is Alice Rostar. Okay. I was sitting next to Alice not that long ago, and I said to her, how much do you charge a word? Because I was just curious what her mark was. And she said, well, my aim is to charge nothing. And so I have there's no reciprocity. However, I do one paid job a year, and I charge, she said something like the equivalent of $25 a word, as opposed to $2 a word.
Which is even high.
Which is high, okay? And I just thought it was interesting because you get paid by the word when you do this, and
she's doing something very interesting on Instagram right now.
Yeah.
When Twitter goes past 140 words, I'm sure she'll be all over that. But she's not getting paid presumably for Instagram posts. but it's quite interesting. She gets the one
Platform,
visual,
yeah.
and then she does like a big fat, heavy paragraph or two that are, kind of dense and wonderful, and you learn stuff, and there are no links allowed, so that's kind of a drag. But that's not her fault. So here is one of the best design journalists ever, embracing some of these new media and finding new readers and new fans. I think because of it. And then yes, maybe her magazine or her newspaper gigs will actually pay the bills.
What do you think about private museums? Because when we were out in LA and we met you, there were these people, private museums, there's a lot of private museums, and they have curators. And there's more and more curatorial positions, I believe, opening up for single, and I don't know why they're called museums, because they're in somebody's cave, or that's the new, the art cave at Sonoma, because they can. Yeah, but I think that's an interesting. If on one angle you look at this as a vocational school, as the one thing that people come out with a skill set that's hireable, I think one of the increasing job opportunities is in the private sector. And I know just.
And as those private sector museums become public or open to the public, it's interesting.
Yeah,
And
well, they
need
do
more.
slightly, a little bit more, but I call them McMuseums.
Well, the Broad.
Because they're usually in a McMansion, and then there's the McMuseum. And, in LA, it's like, whoa, those are jobs, which I'm wondering if people, do you ever address that in the school? You do, with the private, yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, I wonder if the panel, if you wish to, would talk a little bit about the distinction between curatorial practice in temporary exhibitions, in a gallery or Kunsthalle, and permanent collections, as in a museum. Cooper-Hewitt does both. I would just throw out as an aside, about 18 years ago, I was at an annual meeting of what was an organization of directors of small museums. And before the meeting, they asked us if we would all take a Myers-Briggs test and a personality analysis. And at lunch, those who attended were seated, unbeknownst to them, were seated at tables with people who had similar Myers-Briggs scores. And I remember then, 18 years ago, I asked the question whether there was a difference between the INTPs, the perceivers, and the INTJs.
Gee.
Those seem to be the two biggest groups. And there seemed to be that split between the people who chose to become curators at permanent collections were higher on judgmental. That was a bigger issue in their personality makeup. While those who were working in a shop, a magazine, some kind of temporary exhibition space, seem to have a very different. Anyway, I'm wondering if any of you have some thoughts on curatorial practice. Is there a divide between those two things? Some of you do both. How do you feel about it?
I want to jump in just before that question is actually addressed, because we do, my sister does Myers-Briggs with some clients, and she's come every couple of years to do it with my students. And everybody's in 2 little boxes out of 16. And so my sister is like, Allan, you need greater diversity in who you accept into your program. One of the students joked that people go through the Allan filter, and I felt terrible about that. But then, when you read all of the 16 personality types, it's just like, yeah, those 2 people are designers. Like, that's what designers do.
INTPs are architects.
And INTJs, yeah. So it was, I felt terrible about it, and then I sort of felt weirdly vindicated because I read them all, and it's just like, yeah, these 2 people would make appropriate designers, or whatever the word is. So.
We did, at Cooper-Hewitt, we're working with a firm on sort of audience survey stuff, and they did a test with people from the staff, and pretty much most people were in one group, and then maybe a little handful was in the other group. So, but there was very little Right.
I've been on maybe 16 juries, jury duty, criminal, all criminal. I don't do. I'm not available for civil. And where it's I did a couple murders, a lot of rapes, and mostly drug cases. And what's interesting is wherever I would say, you know, in what's it called, where they, you know, voir dire, okay, whatever they would say, I was always picked. Whatever answer I would give, even the answer that I knew, not intentionally, because I like being on a jury, but whatever answer I would give that I knew would throw me off, I was never thrown off, ever. I would have a strong opinion about this, a strong opinion about that, never thrown off. And so I wonder if there's something, if I have some talent, do you know, some inert talent,
You're like the jury king.
and I mention it because I wonder if that goes for curatorial. Like you can take all the tests in the world. Is there a personality prone? Are there a series of traits, personality traits, which makes one a natural?
Yeah,
Probably.
Put money on you.
probably your body language.
Oh, that, yeah.
Well, I think you also have a resilience and a tolerance.
That's
what
what
you
I-
said about like organizing. You know, it's like it's probably appropriate and even flattering that you're acknowledged as the organizer, because like that's so much of the work. It's so much of the hard part. It should actually be honored as such, I think. So you could put up with a lot, I think, as a curator. Be able to put up with a lot.
Yeah.
Withstand.
So back to the question, I actually have not really worked as a curator in a museum where there's been a collection of architecture and design, so I can't really say personally. I curated an exhibition at MoCA that was drawn from the permanent collection, but it was photography and drawings and paintings that, you know, related to a theme I was interested in exploring that related to architecture. But I think generally today there isn't really a lot of difference. And I think it would also depend on the museum and the nature of the collection. So if it was a collection that was very historical, then there may be a difference between curating temporary exhibitions and curating from the collection. But I think most curators that I know tend to be able to do both.
How does acquisition come about at the Cooper-Hewitt? I mean, it's a federal thing to get most things by bequest.
No, I mean, it could be,
Decisions made.
there's an acquisitions committee, things are presented to that committee, it's voted on. The curators present things, they often identify gaps in the collection that they'd like to amplify or expand certain areas. And, you know, it's a range of things. It could be a gift that's offered to the museum by an individual collector. It could be something that we think is interesting and should be in the collection by a contemporary designer that we would maybe ask the designer if they would give us something for the collection. Or we would ask, you know, our donors for funds to help support acquisitions. So it's a whole range of ways that pieces come into the collection.
How does the flow go? Is it usually a curator of a particular surroundings area or something makes a proposal to this committee?
It's discussed within the curatorial department overall. So it's really a sort of group discussion where there would probably be a consensus. And there, you know, ideally there's a plan or some kind of framework that identifies, you know, we're lacking in this area or that area, or we really want to focus on more contemporary work. So then people are thinking about acquisitions with an eye to that. And it's, you know, discussed within that department and with the museum director, and then it is presented to the committee.
I used to be on the board of the Cooper-Hewitt, and one of the things that I don't think people understand is acquisition isn't always proactive on the part of the museum. A big part of the time of that committee is spent evaluating something that somebody was willing to pay for and give to you, and somebody that you need, or and you have to, and do we have to take this? That's like a big thing. That's a really big thing for most museums, I think, and a lot of them. That's like famously, at the end of the 19th century, when the Met, all those museums rose, 1880s, 1890s, they took in, if you go to the storage facility of the Met, you see acres of wrought iron hand railings. Because if you wanted to get that piece of Meissen, you have to take my 700 collection of hand railings. So that's gone away for the most part. But the attachments, like most of it is how do you get out of it?
Or if somebody offers a whole collection,
Yeah.
and maybe not everything in the collection is of interest to the museum, then there's a certain negotiation that has to happen, and whether that collector is willing to, have their collection kind of picked over, that can also happen.
Could be on the wall text, negotiated by.
Right, that would be
That's
good.
right.
That's a good one.
Like broker
Yeah,
by,
yeah.
with brokerage assistance from.
Any more questions? Okay, let's take this last question.
I'm very interested in the idea of curating process, not just the object itself, but the social impact of that object and the user experience. But in a client-based world, it's a very daunting challenge. I see that maybe things are changing, but I'm wondering if you have any insight or wisdom or inspirational message to kind of bridge that gap, to get more into the space of designing process and not just being seen as someone to execute an object to be sold.
I mean, I think we're in an age of sort of the tyranny of the user. Like user-centeredness is like a kind of enlightenment right now. It's not new, but it's new still to a lot of people. I actually think we have bigger problems than users right now. So designers need to be ahead of the agenda. I think designers need to tell, not ask. Your name was on that window. If they didn't like it, like, don't come into the store. It's like that was your house. And people loved it, and anyone who didn't love it, like, the fact that they complained to you, why isn't this in here? I mean, just sort of, it's kind of madness. I want designers to have a very strong point of view, obviously. I like it to be, Canadian socialist, clearly. Yeah, I mean, again, the business of business is to stay in business. The business of consumerism is to make consumer goods and to sell more of them faster and throw them away quicker so that they'll be replaced. It's not rocket science. So the people who are actually good at those things, at feeding that beast, need to get out of it because they're doing a lot of harm. Or I think that they need to be reoriented to doing things that are net positive. And there's a lot to learn about trying to do something that is, in some sense, destined to create destruction and turn it into something that's going to create, creation. And school's a good place to learn how to do that. Online is a great place to learn how to do that. Again, there's so much. John Thackeray's new book is an incredible source of optimism called How to Thrive in the Next Economy. It's an entirely design book. It's certainly for designers, but it's kind of for everybody. And it's just example after example about people using the tools and processes of design, and in some sense, curation, to do really great things in the world. And after you read that book, you're like, oh, I could be involved in this. And I don't actually need to understand form and, hierarchy and some of these other things that have really been canonical in design education, right? I can be great at relationships, or I can be great at connecting dots, or I can be great at showing other people's things. That's my design superpower. I think that there's so many places for people to be in the design world that aren't necessarily designers. It's something we try and teach desperately in the program, but I think it's something that's happening all over the place. But again, the voices of the doomers, also John Thackeray's term, and of Armageddon, and of people just absolutely have given up on the environment, on each other, on any kind of world peace, it's so dispiriting. And I don't know what the counterforce is. I want the counterforce to be design, actually. So.
Yay.
All right, let's go to for some drinks over in the kitchen. And thank you all for coming in. Let's thank our panelists one more time.